Good afternoon. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Todd Zywicki. Todd is a George Mason University Foundation professor. He has been having a lot of fun over the last few years dealing with consumer protection issues and pointing out to the government how wonderful a job they are doing in protecting consumers. He teaches bankruptcy, public choice. His co-author, where's Max? Max and Todd have co-authors of a public choice casebook. Todd is really obviously a valued colleague to have here, but he's been talking about this idea of how the uniqueness of George Mason Law School and kind of our selective stealing of ideas from different schools of thought, and whether or not we have a distinctive view here, although maybe unarticulated until right now. So I'm interested in hearing what Todd has to say. Please give a warm welcome to Todd Zywicki.
Well, thank you, Henry, and thank you, everybody, for coming out on this this great occasion, which is really, in many ways, both a very, very happy occasion as well as, in some sense, a little bit of a sad occasion, I guess, right? Because when this, as we talked about earlier, this is the 40th anniversary of the Law and Economics Center, since that first, the founding of the LEC by Henry Manny at the University of Miami 40 years ago as an official institution. It's also the 10th anniversary of JLEP, and I do remember, and I've been the faculty advisor since the journal was started up, and I remember the moment when that first happened. I do remember the founding of JLEP. I was 8 when the LEC was founded, so I don't remember that founding. But I do remember the founding of JLEP when one of my students came to me and said, Professor Zywicki, this is the Law and Economics School. Isn't it kind of ridiculous that we don't have a student-run journal dedicated to law and economics? And I said, you know, you're right, that is ridiculous. So go do something about it. And sure enough, he did, and the journal has prospered in the intervening period. I think has been an extraordinary addition to the George Mason Law School, and it's been my real privilege to be associated with it. And one of the reasons why, and I'm going to circle back to this at the end, that one of the reasons that it was such a significant occasion to me was it showed the way in which law and economics is so embedded in the culture of George Mason that its students in many ways have come to embrace the unique contributions of George Mason Law School and the ideas that we have here to their education, and I think that's just a really good symbol. Of course, it's also a little bit of a mixed occasion because when he came and asked me for an idea, I had just been looking through the masthead of the Supreme Court Economic Review, where I serve as one of the editors, along with now Michael Grieva and Tom Hazlett. Before that was Josh Wright and Ilya Soman. And a lot of people on the faculty have been the editors of the Supreme Court Economic Review. And I was looking, and we lost these three titans of law and law and economics, all of whom were on the board of advisors of the Supreme Court Economic Review, this extraordinary group that Henry put together and Peter Aronson, I think, was involved in setting up Supreme Court Economic Review, another person we lost before his time. But Bork, Alchian, and Buchanan were all members of the Supreme Court Economic Review editorial board, and of course, all three of them, as you've heard this morning, and we'll hear again this afternoon, made quite significant contributions to the George Mason University over time. Alchian, obviously, as the workhorse that we heard in the judicial education program. Judge Bork, who taught here in the mid-1980s, and I was trying to pin down the exact date, so I emailed Max and I said, do you know when Bork taught here? And Max said, yes, I know exactly why, because I was hired to replace him when he stopped teaching here. So so he was here for a few years, and of course, for many people, the first time they ever heard of George Mason University was during the Supreme Court hearings, in which he was occasionally identified as a George Mason law professor. And of course, Jim Buchanan, who, as Henry suggested this morning, was very instrumental. First bringing the Public Choice Center here, and then bringing Henry to George Mason, and the great combinations we've had and the synergies we've had with the Economics Department, the Public Choice Center here at George Mason, are obviously part of what the reason that the university is prospered. And so I think it's in sort of looking forward and looking where you're at today, I think it's appropriate to look back at this. I think it might also be useful in sort of framing my remarks. Perhaps it might be useful. I think it might be to maybe talk a little bit about myself and how I ended up here, because I think in many ways maybe I'm the second generation of George Mason Law School, and the way I kind of ended up here is I think a good indication of how Henry Manny, sort of the Johnny Appleseed of law and economics, planted trees of law and economics around the country that have come to fruition in the current generation of law and economics scholars, which I would include myself and Josh and Jeff Manny and Max and a lot of others. And I first kind of got into this world through working at FEE and then at the Institute for Humane Studies, and through IHS I discovered the Austrians and the Public Choice School, and as a result of that I did my undergraduate thesis on Hayek, and on the entire Dartmouth campus at the time I could not find a single professor who knew anything about Hayek, which I think was quite sort of a statement in and of itself. Somewhere in there I met Don Boudreau, and I don't know if Don's still here, but we started that kind of started a long relationship where Don has introduced me a lot of these ideas, and then we took turns being at Clemson for a while there. But after college, I ended up at Clemson, and this was really a pivotal moment for me, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that Clemson itself was part of the satellite of what Henry Manny had set up, and there I met Dan Benjamin, who we heard from this morning, Roger Miners, Bob Staff, and others, all of whom had some contact with the Law and Economics Center through time, and ended up basically teaching in economics programs, right? So we're talking about law schools today, but there's this whole other body, which is those economists who came through Henry's program of law for economists as well as economics for law professors. And I didn't know that much about Clemson, and so Roger Miners said, well, the guy you need to talk to is Fred McChesney. And so Fred McChesney sold me on going to Clemson, getting my master's degree in economics and studying with these guys. And I think through that experience and sort of seeing what developed at Clemson, I think in many ways sort of shows the hybrid that's emerged out of George Mason. I was exposed to Chicago tradition through guys like Bill Dugan and Donald Gordon, the great Donald Gordon. Public choice, a lot of the guys from Virginia Tech, Virginia, George Mason, the UCLA tradition, Dan Benjamin, Matt Lindsay, and others, and the Washington tradition, which is sort of the one absence here today. I was talking with Terry Anderson during one of the breaks, that the Washington tradition, other than Bruce Johnson, of course, is the, fortunately, I guess in some sense, all right, I don't know exactly how to say it, right, but Douglas North could be part of this conversation, right? The Washington School could be part of this conversation, I guess is how I could put it, right? But from that, then I went to UVA and encountered the first generation of people that Henry sent through his program, guys like Bob Scott, Tom Jackson, people like that who kind of were that first generation of law and economics, and then here to George Mason. Somewhere in there, of course, and I think it's an important part of this story, is that I think has helped to propagate George the law and economics generally, was the creation of the Federal Society, right? And the Federal Society is important in this story as I'll come back to later, because I think it's knit together some different intellectual traditions in an important way. And it's not insignificant that, that it was right around this era where I'm going through school, where the massacre of Judge Bork occurred on national television. And that was quite an experience for those of us who were law students at the time, who believed in sort of a lot of these sorts of ideas. And I think it, in many ways, highlighted a lot of things that became significant. So, in some sense, I feel like I've kind of lived the tradition that we're talking about here today, and I'm going to try to generalize it in a few minutes today. And I'm going to take as my text, as Henry suggested, the question is there a George Mason School of Law and Economics? Is there a George Mason School of Law and Economics, a distinct tradition that has evolved, perhaps without anybody knowing it, here at George Mason, and with our fellow travelers who we've heard today, in which Henry and the Law and Economics Center, both Henrys and the Law and Economics Center have kind of become the hub of that activity. And perhaps now what can Alchian, Bork, and Buchanan tell us about that, right? Alchian is a stand-in for the UCLA tradition, Bork as a stand-in for the Chicago tradition, and Buchanan is a stand-in for the Virginia tradition here. Now, in asking the question whether is there a George Mason School of Law and Economics, I want to first start and emphasize very strongly, I want to credit my colleague Jeff Parker over here in the corner, who is the one who first mentioned this idea to me, and I think it and started me thinking about this. And I think Jeff has written some things on this, and I think that Jeff goes a long way to answering the question, which is Jeff takes it up, and basically he focuses on Hayek. And Jeff's view is that the distinct contribution of George Mason is basically bringing Hayek and information discovery into law and economics. And he associates this view with, in particular, Henry Manny, and Henry Manny's view of insider trading and other aspects of corporate governance, which bring the idea of information generation and transmission front and center into a world where it previously had not existed. And I think that even though Hayek isn't on the program today, I think that Jeff is exactly right that an important part of whatever is the George Mason School of Law and Economics is the influence of Hayek and information economics and information discovery that also overlaps, obviously, with some of the other people that we're talking about today, right? And so, as I focus on the UCLA, Virginia, and Chicago schools, I don't want to suggest that that we slight Hayek and the Austrians. They just don't happen to have somebody on the program right now. Although, as we'll talk about, I think Buchanan overlaps with a lot of these guys. And in some sense, I don't want to slight other schools, but I think there is something significant. For instance, in Judge Posner's recent article, where he compares Hans Kelsen, the legal positivist, and Hayek, and basically says that Kelsen is a better law and economics scholar than Hayek. And he's got a long, elaborate view on why that is, but I think it says something about one view of the world in law and economics that is different from how we've traditionally seen things here at George Mason, where I think that position would not curry a majority vote among our faculty if forced to choose between Kelsen and Hayek as to which was a better law and economics scholar. So let's start off with the UCLA school, right? And we heard some of this this morning, and in many ways, just sort of empirically looking at things, is if you had to pick, sort of just by looking down the roster of our faculty, what has been the dominant influence, you'd have to start with the UCLA school, right? Obviously, the impact of Varman, but also the number of UCLA products that are on our faculty that was referred to this morning, beginning with Tim Uris, but also Bruce Kobayashi, Tom Hazlett, Josh Wright of over time. And in many ways, it's kind of funny. I know that Henry went to University of Chicago, but in many ways, when I read Henry Manny's work and you talk to Henry, he may have gotten his education at, I guess he went to school at Chicago, but he was educated by UCLA, maybe is that how we can put it, right? And what is it that I think is, what does GMU draw from UCLA? Well, I think a little bit of this was alluded to this morning in Josh Wright's comments. And I first heard this from Peter Bettke. He was in a similar view, which is I think the tradition that we've developed here is a looking out the window rather than a looking at the blackboard type of questions. That economists can get their questions from two different places. They're looking out the window or looking at the blackboard. And there is a world out there in which people sort of talk to other academics and develop more and more elaborate models based on more and more assumptions that don't really tell us much about the real world. I've always gotten the sense that that's not what we're about here. That's not the kind of thing that capture the imagination of people at George Mason. And I think the fact that a lot of the most influential ideas we've had here are just good applications of price theory and supply and demand. I think a lot of that comes from Alchian, Demsetz, Klein and Loeffler, and the like. And I remember this question in sort of a classic sort of style, in the same sort of way we heard it this morning, was when I was in grad school and I had Matt Lindsay for industrial organization. He basically posed the question in introducing Klein and Loeffler, why does Coca-Cola still advertise, right? Everybody in the world at this point is at some point in their life had a Coca-Cola. And they know whether they like it or not, right? Why does Coke still advertise, right? So one of these classic kind of UCLA type questions that spin off in a lot of different sorts of ways. And I think that what this leads us to, and what the UCLA tradition brings to George Mason, is sort of a proto new institutional economics sort of view, which I hope comes out in the paper that Jeff and I have done for this conference, in sort of understanding what institutions are doing within this system, and not abstracting from institutions, but understanding the way in which institutions play into market processes. I think a second idea that I get from the UCLA tradition, again overlapping with Hayek and the Austrians, is that there's a sort of a respect for decentralized evolutionary processes and private ordering here, which that Jeff and I bring out, but also is sort of implied in Hayek, but I think is implied in a lot of the sorts of ideas we have. Of course, obviously Demsetz's view on property rights and the evolution of property rights fits within this. And I think this is a strand that has been particularly prominent in Mason's faculty over time. This notion of decentralized evolutionary processes and a skepticism to some extent of a top-down ordering. And I think, just to give a couple examples, Bruce and Larry Ribstein's work on the evolution of LLCs and those sorts of institutions. Aaron O'Hara's work with Larry Ribstein on the law market and choice of law, and sort of the emergence of efficient rules out of sort of private ordering type ideas. Adam Mossoff's work today, I think, on the historical analysis of patent thickets of how people actually solve these theoretical problems in practice, I think, are consistent with this. Francesco Parisi's work when he was here on sort of rulemaking institutions and that sort of thing, I think, fits in this. And in particular, I also think my co-author Max Stearns, and I think his work on the evolution of Supreme Court precedent, I think is a really powerful analytical tool, right? Of sort of trying to bring disciplined economics to what otherwise is often thought of by calling out professors just kind of a political free-for-all, right? identifying evolutionary patterns within Supreme Court decision making that I think are relevant. The third idea that's related to that we discussed this morning is the importance of property rights, right? And basically getting the micro foundations correct, right? And aligning incentives with decision-making power. Obviously, this is at the heart of Henry's work, and I think is something that we see running through the George Mason tradition. Second, let me turn to the Virginia School in Buchanan, because I think this is another thing that is very prominent in the George Mason Law School tradition, and perhaps less so elsewhere in terms of the important role that it's played. And basically the idea of the public choice tradition, as well as another neglected part of Buchanan, I think, which is the importance of subjective value in a way in which he overlaps with the Austrians. And related to that, finally, the idea of economics as exchange, because I think these are all ideas that we've incorporated here. And like the UCLA school, of course, Virginia Tech, which used to be VPI, but then at some point became Virginia Tech, right? And are very prominent in this history, obviously, with Henry Butler being there. Fred McChesney, who we've always kind of considered a part of the dystopia of George Mason, George Mason law professor at heart, and one of our fellow travelers, right? But the importance of the Virginia and the Virginia schools is part of this. And again, I think and this is, I think, perhaps best captured in the fact that, to the best of my knowledge, when Max first started teaching public choice in the law here, whenever that was, in the 90s, or whatever, early 90s, I suspect we were the only law school in America that had a public choice in the law class, and it's been a staple of our curriculum ever since. And judging by the fact that nobody will adopt mine and Max's book, apparently it's still we're somewhat of an outlier in terms of seeing the value of a public choice in the law class in the curriculum. But I think that is a notable indication of the way in which these ideas have come into the George Mason tradition. I think in many ways, then, this is the recognition, often honored in the breach by economists, that we have to be aware of the possibility of government failure or the cost of collective decision making, and not just focus on market failure. I think is an idea that's very much part of the George Mason tradition, and again, in many ways reflected, I think, somewhat of the unique research interest of our faculty, whether it's David Bernstein's extraordinary work, in my view, on the sort of the history around the Lochner case, and sort of bringing public choice tools to bear on questions of legal history, to look at those in a new way, whether it's Aaron and Larry Ripstein's work, Bruce and Larry Ripstein's work on the public choice questions associated with model codes versus allowing spontaneous order and evolution of rules. I think I would place my work on the 17th Amendment and that sort of thing in there, and the responses that I've gotten from fellow George Mason faculty in the same vein, and Jonathan Adler, one of our most distinguished alumni, and of course his work on environmental economics and environmental regulation, which reflects much of this as well. I think another place where we see this is in subjective value, and the role of subjective value, which again is often associated with the Austrians, but we can also credit to Buchanan and his, I think his extraordinary book, Cost and Choice. And in this sense, we can see this in Tim Muris's early contributions to the economics of contracting and contracts, if you're not familiar with this, where his analysis of contracts and contract damages bring subjective value and subjective cost into the discussion in a way in which it hadn't been done before that. One of the things that's interesting talking about Buchanan to me was in preparation for this lecture, it was a delight to go back and reread Henry Manny. He mentioned this morning, reread his book review of The Calculus of Consent when it first came out. And to see, of course, the significant idea that comes out of Henry's book reviews, the idea of taking the ideas developed in the calculus of consent about voting and applying them in this different context of corporate voting and the like, which I think is very, very consistent with things here. The final idea that's related to this, I think, from Buchanan is the idea of economics as exchange, and we'll be hearing about this after lunch in Pete Betke's paper, which I think captures this really nicely. But it emerges out of this idea, I think, of subjective value. And that'll segue us into Bork, which is that one of the things that I find very prominent and important in Buchanan is the thinking of economics as a science of exchange rather than the science of maximization. And I think we kind of heard that implicitly in our discussion of Alchian this morning. If you think of economics as the science of exchange, in some sense, as opposed to the science of individual maximization, that focuses you on a different set of questions, right? That focuses you on the types of institutional questions that we were addressing, I think, in the Alchian type question, in the Alchian session. And I think that idea is something that we've picked up from Buchanan in the Virginia School. So let me turn to Robert Bork and then finish with some closing remarks. I think that Bork, in some sense, we can think of him as a stand-in for the Chicago tradition, which I've neglected a little bit, but obviously is sort of the traditional tradition of law and economics. And I think Robert Bork's work on antitrust law is sort of, as I read, pretty much straight Chicago school, right? In some sense, it's defining the Chicago School of Law and Economics, and obviously that's an important part of what we do here, right? And I think George Mason's influence on antitrust is been really quite profound. Obviously, Tim Uris is the chairman of the FTC. Josh Wright, who's on the FTC. Maureen Olhausen, an alum who is on the FTC. Apparently, Bill Kovacic had been chairman. Apparently, some relationship to George Mason is now a necessary condition for being a Republican appointee to the FTC. So sorry to break your hearts if you had your heart set on that, right? And I think in some sense it's kind of reached its apotheosis today, which is, I will say, and hands down today, now that with Doug Ginsburg on our faculty and Josh and Tim and some of the other things, I think we have unquestionably, hands down, no questions asked, the top antitrust faculty in the world. And perhaps among the greatest assemblage of antitrust talent in one place that perhaps has ever existed in any law school. And I think that is an extraordinary statement in testament to George Mason. The second strand, though, may be a little less obvious. And I was talking with Jeremy Rabkin about this, which is there's a sense in which over time, George Mason, as we've matured, as Henry said, we used to not have any con law professors, right? And as we've matured over time, sort of we brought in more of a public law tradition and the like. And Doug Ginsburg made an off the cuff a joke this morning. I think actually a little bit of truth of it when he was talking about sort of finding con law people who could teach at George Mason, right? And there's two different ways you can get to this, right? One is the important work that Max did, right? Which is Max took con law and put it into an economic framework, right? And basically gave us an analytical construct about teaching con law. The problem is that Max is kind of sui generis. I don't know if there's any other con law person out there who brings the analytical chops and rigor that Max brings to it. The other half of it, though, is this uneasy or sort of not obvious alliance where people like Nelson Lund and sort of originalism has married up with law and economics, and it's kind of taken for granted, right? I mean, it's kind of the Federalist Society coalition, but it's not obvious that that necessarily is the case. You know, what is it that perhaps for some reason leads originalism in con law to link up with law and economics? Now, and I think what it is perhaps the economic mindset makes us aware of the agency cost, potential agency cost problems with judges, right? That taking economics and applying it to everybody within the political system makes much more prominent the idea of agency costs by judges, the concern that judges sort of misusing their power to read their views into the law, right? So one approach would be Max's approach to suggest, well, there actually is a logic there, right? That they are constrained. Another view, though, I think leads us towards something like an originalist a sort of idea that also marries up with some of the other things we said, right? We're going to hear this marvelous paper by John McGinnis that we'll hear after lunch, talking about Bork and Buchanan in originalism. But I think that's important because it gets us to some of these ideas, right? If you see politics as a science of exchange, as an application of exchange framework, then as opposed to a maximization type framework, right? Then you have a very different view of the political process and what the role of a judges, what judges might be in that. But I think the second idea that I think is interesting about this, and relate to this, is, and I'm going to take you back to Jim Buchanan's review of the first edition of the Economic Analysis of Law, which very few people have probably ever read, but it was called Good Economics and Bad Law. And basically what Buchanan says is, look, Posner, you've gotten the economics right, but you've misunderstood the role of the judge, right? A judge is not a legislator. It's not your job to make the law the way you think it should be. It's your job to provide a framework and to basically don't get too big for your britches, right? And I think that may be the idea that knits this all together, kind of in the George Mason tradition, and I think perhaps doesn't make us originalists necessarily, but gravitates us in a direction, in a Buchanan-like direction, to basically say, yeah, we think economics is really powerful, and it's really powerful in particular places, but at the same time we're concerned about agency costs by judges in that sort of thing. And I think that Buchanan review of economic analysis law, while everybody here obviously is a fan of Posner, I think that speaks to the George Mason tradition, maybe not universally, but in some sense. I want to close by, and hopefully I've not gone too far over my time, I want to close by saying one final thing about the George Mason tradition, which I think is cultural, and I think is important for thinking about what the future of the George Mason tradition might be. There's this marvelous story that Henry tells, that I read it as I was preparing for this in his interview with the SEC Historical Society. And he tells the story of finally getting a call, I think it was from Yale Law School, asking Henry if he wanted to teach there, to which Henry responded, "You're 2 weeks and 5 years too late." To which he said, "What do you mean?" And Henry said, "Well, 2 weeks ago I decided to start this Law and Economics Center. And 5 years ago, I gave a damn about whether Yale wanted to hire me, but I don't anymore." Right? And I think there's something in that says something about the spirit of George Mason Law School and the George Mason School of Law and Economics that I think is very important. Right? Which is. I think we've always had a little bit of an outsider culture here, right? Which is that we are a place that holds ourselves to our own norms of excellence and our own standards of excellence. Our workshop culture is a very sharp workshop culture, as people routinely tell us if they've done workshops at other places. It's not show and tell. And I think related to this is something that Max was reminding me during the break earlier today, which is that that at the heart of the George Mason School is that we see economics as being methodological, not political, right? Which is that what we are interested in is the analytical process of creating and testing hypotheses And even if that leads you to some place that may be politically incorrect or somewhat controversial, that's secondary to the analytical rigor of the argument and understanding what the flow of the argument is and thinking about how you would test it. And I think in the end, the great aspect of this is that I think a lot of the things I'm talking about would not have been written at any other law school in America. That the kind of products that have come out of this school are a product of the synergies that have grown up around this law school, the kind of unique contributions of current and alumni of the law school, Aaron, Larry Ribstein, others, and the like. And why does that matter? I think in the end, what does George Mason Law School look like going forward? And I think the culture is important to this, right? Which is, we heard this morning, for instance, the rise, and I might characterize it as the disappearance of the UCLA tradition, right? The rise of law and economics at the University of Chicago, whereas today I think it's just kind of another law school, right, of which law and economics is part of it. Whether it's the UCLA School of Economics, and the Austrian outpost that it was NYU, the University of Washington, and the tradition that grew up around there. These distinct traditions seem to be difficult to sustain. And one of the things that I think is very gratifying about being here at George Mason is that we've turned over the faculty. The LEC's been around for 40 years. Henry took over the law school in the early 80s. And what I think one of the gratifying things is that the tradition continues today, that our young faculty are better than us old guys, a lot of it. It's extraordinary the talent that we have in our young faculty, what they are bringing to the table. And I think finally, and I'll close on this note, one of the gratifying things about this is the way in which it's filtered down to the students. And the fact that we've got JLEP and so many of these students who are here today who are engaged in this and are interested in this, I think speaks volumes to what to what this law school is and what in the distinctive tradition that we've developed here. Thanks.